Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Connected by Controversy. I'm your host, Chris White. A big interest of mine is the history of immigration from all over the world. Immigration is a long established human pattern. People leave for a variety of reasons, from famine and war to opportunity and freedom. The US is in a lot of ways a unique immigration destination throughout history because from the beginning, about 4 centuries ago, its size and relative lack of established ethno-geographic standards of nationalism has facilitated relatively the entry of people from around the world. By comparison to other places is what I'm talking about. In this country, we think about waves of immigrants from different countries dating back to the English in the 1600s and 1700s, to the French, Irish, Germans, Eastern European Jews, and Italians in the 1800s, and finally, the rest of the world in the 20th century to today. In the midst of all this generalization is a fascinating history of Eastern Europeans who have been settling in this country actually since the beginning. And now there's only a little bit in the beginning. In fact, the first Ukrainian to arrive here was Ivan Bogdan, who arrived in Jamestown in 1607. However, the first large-scale Ukrainian migrations to the US began in the 1880s. Most arrived in New York City, Philadelphia, other big cities. And our guest today grew up in one of those. Dr. Kateryna Schray is professor of English at Marshall University. She's Ukrainian American, of which there are over 1 million today. And she grew up in Philadelphia. I wanted to talk to her today so she can shed some light on the Ukrainian American experience. Welcome, Kateryna.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So what can you tell us about where your family is originally from?
My family's from Western Ukraine, and I'm going to share my screen with you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And show you a little bit on the map where we're from. So my dad was born in Lviv, which is the westernmost big city. Well, it's a big city in the West. And right now they're starting to have air raid sirens every night. My grandmother was born in Ternopil, which is a smaller city over here, a little bit more towards the inside of the country. We have friends and family throughout this whole area. This part of the country is very Ukrainian, and for the most part Catholic, which is different from this part of the country, which tends to have more Russian speakers and is more Orthodox. Lviv has an interesting history in that it was under Poland, Lithuanian for a while. It was never actually part of the Russian Empire. And it just has it's a very interesting city. It's architecture. You can walk down a single street and then see architecture representing different decades, different centuries. It's just a very highly cultured city, absolutely beautiful. And it's a crossroads of a lot of folks going from one place to another, which I guess is the definition for crossroads. It's a crossroads of cultures. Lviv is known to be a crossroads of culture.
So, and this is the traditional Galicia region?
Halychina, yes. Halychina, yes, that's exactly right. The Carpathian Mountains are like over here someplace. And yes, Halychina is what this area is called. I haven't heard that.
So different pronunciation, right? So Galicia, I guess that comes from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's the way they term it, right? Maybe that's where the Catholicism comes from.
Yes, yeah.
Or maybe before, I'm not sure. I'm just getting to learn Ukrainian history, and it is just fascinating. I'm glad you pointed that out, that difference between the West and the East, and in fact that there are those mountains over there too.
You know, it's funny you say you just learned. Like I'm Ukrainian. I grew up Ukrainian. All I know, like I'm Ukrainian. I went to 12 years of Saturday Ukrainian school. I went to a Ukrainian university in the summers. I am Ukrainian, and yet all of this that's happening today is making me kind of relearn or expand my understanding of what that actually means. I mean, it's one thing to grow up culturally Ukrainian and kind of not so much take it for granted, but you kind of live it every day. So it's not really it's not something that you really think about. You are Ukrainian, and you eat Ukrainian food, and your parents bank at a Ukrainian credit union, and you go to piano lessons, your teacher's Ukrainian. You go to Scouts, it's in Ukrainian. It was called Plast, which anybody in your audience who knows what a Ukrainian is will know. Plast and Sum. Those are the two competing Scout organizations. And so you shop in Ukrainian stores, and all this is very normal. You worship at a Ukrainian, in my case, it was Ukrainian Catholic church, plenty of friends that worship in Ukrainian Orthodox churches. So I know what it means to be Ukrainian American. but I am learning so much right now about my own, like things that I knew about my history are now being put into context and are now being lived out through the terrible things that are happening in Ukraine. So it's funny that you say you're learning about Ukraine. I would never would have, if I would have said the one thing I'm an expert on is being Ukrainian, turns out I have a lot to learn myself.
I love that. I constantly have to remind myself too that even if I think I know something, being exposed to another voice, another source, another map, interpretation, that just adds more dimensions to our knowledge, and it's a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, we have to learn about it as a result of this war. And so, can you talk about the circumstances that brought your family over here?
Yeah. My father is from Ukraine. My mom's from Riga, Latvia. Her mother was Russian and her mother's father was Ukrainian. So, and this is not unusual in Europe to have family from multiple places. In fact, growing up, it wasn't unusual at a family reunion to the extent that we could have those from people who made it over here to America. It wasn't unusual to speak Latvian to one relative, turn around Russian to another, Ukrainian to another, and then German to another. And so sometimes you'd be trying a couple languages before you realize, oh yeah, that's right, this is how we communicate. But it was completely normal, it's completely natural. So my parents, my father was born in 1935, my mom in 1936, really close. They're even though in different countries, their experience parallels each other so well. Around the age of 9, 10, each had to flee their own country. So my father fled Lviv when he was 9 years old. And the images he's seeing on TV right now are shattering to him because he literally sees himself and his mom fleeing as he watches the news. So then both my parents spent a good 4 or 5 years in a displaced persons camp in Germany. And part of that was also spent in terms of wellness camps where kids who are undernourished would be taken to sanitariums, health places, and fattened up and attended to their health. And then they migrated, both immigrated to the United States separately. They didn't meet till grad school here, actually, in Philadelphia. But emigrating to the United States was a pretty typical thing for Ukrainians displaced by the war. And so the northern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Detroit, had large enclaves of Ukrainians, and this was completely normal. I actually did not really I didn't realize I was part of a subculture for the first maybe 10 years of my life. And it's not like I didn't know. I mean, we watched TV, we had TV, so that was a TV language. We went outside, we played with the neighborhood kids, so we knew there were other languages around. It didn't feel weird. It was completely normal. This is just my life. I had plenty of kids like me. There were probably 30 kids in my Ukrainian school, in my class, in my Ukrainian school. And so our parents preserved their culture. My mom and dad got married, and shockingly, each brought their widowed mothers to live with them. So today, like as a married person myself, this would be very difficult. Not because my mom or my mother-in-law, they're both great women, but this is just very difficult. But it's very normal. In Eastern European culture, you take care of the older generation. So I was born into a household with 2 grandmothers and parents, and then my brother and sister followed. And so we had our own little like multilingual household.
They must have had some difficulty getting out of Europe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My mom, it's funny. I've heard the same stories all my life. It was so many close calls. My father and his mother did not talk about the horrors of war. We knew it was hard. Like, for example, my dad's dad didn't make it. He didn't make it to the US. And so my father's side of the family is more quiet about it, intentionally quiet about it. My mom has always shared her stories, and they're all horrible. They're all 100% horrible, and the things that she witnessed as a child. And it's interesting, as I always thought the stories were horrible as a kid. Like I remember as a kid, I remember staying at a house in New Jersey, and it was next to an airport. And I remember a plane flying overhead, and my brother, sister, and I terrified, running for cover, which makes no sense. We've never been bombed, but we knew that that was a bad sign that planes were coming. So clearly the stories we heard as children were definitely part of our genetic fear. But my mom, as we get older, she revisits the same stories, but the details get worse, like really bad. the things that she witnessed as a child. So many close calls. I mean, literally get on this train or get on this train. They got lucky. They got on the right train. The other train got bombed, and not just bombed. And I don't want to talk. I don't want to. There's such a thing as secondary trauma. And I don't want to do that to your viewers. Just really horrible. The one thing I will say, like this is like the least traumatic thing I can say when my mom talks about this. She remembers the smell of burning flesh. You know, when she would come into a train station that got bombed and other places. Like that's weird. That not weird, but that is what she remembers as a child. And yeah, just absolutely difficult and horrible stories to get here.
Of course. And I think it's important for people to understand that the United States represented a kind of a destination where people could flee from those types of horrors that were going on in Europe too. And that it's, I don't know, that maybe that feeds into kind of our broader tapestry, is to understand that we're kind of a country that houses a lot of people whose previous generations were traumatized as a result of wars that are going on like now.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's, you know, our country is not perfect. United States is not perfect by any means, but it is a place of healing. It can be. It's a place of refuge, a place of rescue. I even felt it a little bit when I spent some time in Ukraine doing relief work, and I remember every time I came home just wanting to kiss the ground. It was just it's just nice, but it's more than that. Here in America, there's Palestinians and Jews are in conflict, right, in the Middle East. Here, you walk down the street in New York, you have a Palestinian appliance store next to a Jewish appliance store. You have a Ukrainian bakery next to a Russian delicatessen. Like this, people are okay here. Like we get along here. We get along here because all of the external pressures and dangers are removed. We get along. There's something that I still firmly believe in, the hope of America, that we don't always get it right, but man, we have the best chance here to get it right. And you see so many conflicts that are so violent and so passionate, and here it's somehow we're able to lay them aside and work together when we choose to.
Oh, that's a great way of putting it. Especially that's probably the biggest conflict of the past 70, 80 years is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And as you said, they can just coexist here. They're not fighting over land like they are there. And the historical, geographical, ethnic memory and implications of every square yard of land in that hemisphere makes it so much different than over here. So it's not really by merits of the people here necessarily over in the land. This is like an island that people weren't, that Europeans weren't there before, and now they're over here, and others too, Africans and Asians too. Unfortunately, Native Americans had to be displaced.
Yeah, that's hard.
Right, like you say, yeah, we can't just dismiss our own history, but but putting that aside, and we need to in order to move forward. We can represent something that's different for the way forward, especially for leading the world. And can you talk about? I'm really interested in this Ukrainian enclave or community that you grew up in. I have to admit, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there was a little Russian sector, but there could have even been a Ukrainian one, and I didn't know about it at the time. But can you talk to us about this?
Yeah. Probably like more famous examples are like things like Chinatown. Like a lot of cities will have that. A lot of cities will have Little Italy. Philadelphia is a large Korean community. Yeah, so it's basically it moves as the population becomes a little bit wealthier. So when the Ukrainian immigrants first arrived, of course, you're going to live wherever you can, and you improve that place as best you can. And because you're all poor, you're going to end up roughly in the same general area. You're going to build churches there, and eventually maybe a community center. And then, you know, as people sort of like acclimate to their new situations, that first generation. So my grandmothers, so my dad and my mom each came over with their mom. There was no more dads involved. And so I'll talk about my father's side because that is the Ukrainian side. They were really comfortable. They were actually very active in Lviv. They had a really good life in Lviv. My grandmother immediately went to work in a sewing factory and cleaning because that's what it took to get my dad, who was 16, I guess at that point, into high school and just kind of get him situated. I'm actually so my grandmother was 40 when she had my dad. I was 40 when I had my youngest, and my youngest son is 16 and I'm 56. So I am in exactly the same age right now as my grandmother was when she came over with her son. And I can't imagine that, leaving everything behind and not speaking the language, my son not speaking the language, but now I'm 100% dependent on him because he's younger, he's strong. And my son actually has my dad's build. My dad's like 6'5". My youngest is going to hit 6'5" any day now. Awkward, skinny. And in my father's case, probably undernourished and severely traumatized. But somehow, through the grace of God, they made it. They made it. My father worked for a gardener. And that money that he brought in as a teenager, 16-year-old, together with the money my grandmother made in a sewing factory, was enough for them to live on. He got very lucky. He went to a Catholic high school in the Philadelphia area, and they were very generous to him. And they helped him get into LaSalle University. At that point, my dad played soccer, but not like, I don't think there was any scholarships involved. Basically, people were very kind and to immigrants. My mother talks about this all the time. My mother is a big fan of care packages, just because she has such good memories of those boxes arriving. And they always had like a Hershey chocolate bar in it, and cigarettes. Cigarettes, they would trade for stuff because they weren't smokers, but that was great. That was currency. And the chocolate bar was something that she to this day remembers, even though she doesn't she treasures that. In any case, through the grace of God and a lot of sacrifice and a lot of humility, my parents, who both arrived basically with a suitcase each, and their moms, made it through. My dad made it through LaSalle University. My mom made it through Immaculata College. Very parallel stories. And then they met in grad school at the University of Pennsylvania. My mom thought my dad was a jerk. And that he was kind of an arrogant. He is actually not a jerk, but he is very arrogant. God, he is a great guy. He's 86 years old. He has spent his entire life working for to free Ukraine. And when Ukraine became free in 1991, then our world changed. Our whole world changed. Our whole family life. When my parents got married, they raised us they decided the family language was going to be Ukrainian and the dominant culture was going to be Ukrainian, because Ukraine was more under a threat than Latvia. I mean, Latvia also was under the Union, but Ukrainians were very much imperiled. They raised us precisely in fear that this day would come, that someday Ukraine would be wiped out. And this way we would preserve the culture, the heritage, the language, the traditions, the folklore, all that stuff.
Wow. I mean, just to kind of imagine this, your community existing, struggling, and emerging within this country, and then having future generations come afterwards, is that kind of a imagination, I think, in the American mind needs to happen more often. We need to learn about more of these immigrant groups, because Ukrainians make up, I guess it's 3 out of every 1,000 Americans are Ukrainians. That's not insignificant. And so that's something that we could learn more about in our school books, I think. One thing that I always tell people, if they really want to understand a culture, is to understand their food. Can you talk about Ukrainian food?
I love Ukrainian food. It's very poor food. It's very inexpensive. So everybody knows about borscht. Borscht is this beet-based soup that a lot of Poles have it, Russians have it, Belarusians have it. So that's probably the most famous thing we have. We have something called bereniki, which I think the Polish people call pierogies, and then stuffed cabbage. All these ingredients are very simple and very inexpensive, but those would be the biggies. Those would be the big foods. And they are associated with certain times of year. In some cases, every holiday has its own kind of prescribed food thing. I remember trying to describe Ukrainian food to my friends in high school who couldn't and it was funny because I was describing it and saying that, no, there's lots of people like me. They're like, do they all live with you? I said, no, they don't all live with me. It's just a little Ukrainian neighborhood. And it was funny kind of trying to explain what a Ukrainian was. Can I give you an example of that?
Please. Yeah.
So when I was, I think 12 or 13, I was babysitting and I was watching an episode of Saturday Night Live at the house I was babysitting at. And there was a skit and had Gilda Radner in it. I don't even remember what the point of the skit was. It was just she played a maid in a hotel, and I don't remember what the comedy was. But she was a Ukrainian maid. She only had like one line, minor character, totally irrelevant in the skit. But she was a Ukrainian maid, and I was like, oh my gosh! Like I've never heard the word Ukrainian on TV. I was just like I'm like sat up. I'm like listening to this, and because it was so rare to have somebody know what a Ukrainian was. Most of the time people just assumed it was the same as Russian or something like that. And so I remember being excited. Flash forward to a couple weekends ago with that beautiful Saturday Night Live cold open when they had the choir Dumka sing a prayer for Ukraine. Interesting choice too, what they did. That wasn't the Ukrainian national anthem. That was literally a prayer for God to bless and save Ukraine. And so we've come a long way, right? We've come a long way from nobody knowing what a Ukrainian was to now to being pretty much in the front and center in the news right now for sad reasons, but nonetheless, it's and in between, in the meantime, growing up every decade, I'd run into someone, oh, I'm Ukrainian, oh yeah, I know what that is. So you just like it just becomes more familiar. Ukrainians just became more and more familiar, probably because there are more of us. You marry into families. My husband's whole family now knows what a Ukrainian is, and he's one of 9 kids. So it's just normal. It's just normal acclimatizing, blending into the bigger culture without losing your own identity.
I can only think of a couple of times when I've seen or heard Ukraine mentioned in pop culture, and I'm instantly reminded of a couple of scenes from Seinfeld, actually, but they refer to it as the Ukraine. Can you talk about why that's really not correct?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for asking that. Thank you for asking that. So that actually drove my dad crazy.
I bet.
And I remember constantly correcting that as well. Yeah. So so it's the United States. It's those are plural countries. The Ukraine Ukrainians found it kind of insulting in that it suggested it was a region or a part of something else, and in this case, Russia. So Ukraine was a country in the Soviet Union, but it was never part of Russia. Although that's exactly what Vladimir Putin now is suggesting, the opposite. So the Ukraine it was painful to hear because it's very dismissive, and it suggested that Ukraine was not its own sovereign nation.
Okay, that makes sense then. I remember growing up in California. There were a lot of Salvadoran refugees there in the 80s and 90s, but there were also a lot of Mexicans there too. And the Salvadorans didn't like being equated with Mexicans. Not that they didn't like them, but they wanted everybody to understand, even though we're a little country, we are our own country, we're our own culture as well. Yeah. Those kinds of differences matter, even though there might be a lot in common too. Religion, especially in the eastern portion, and the language has some similarities to Kievan Rus and all that. But there are these distinctions between them, and especially the sovereignty of Ukraine in the past 31 years has been very important.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's key. So I remember being in Ukraine. Let's see, I was there before. Well, it was still the Soviet Union, and right when the Soviet Union dissolved. So my first time in Ukraine, I was kind of amazing, actually, because I had been Ukrainian American. So I was Ukrainian, but it was always within this like shell of an American, which was fine. In Ukraine, that shell was gone. I was just Ukrainian, but I wasn't. I still had the Americans, and this is what I mean by this. I don't know if it was 89, 87, I'm not sure, but I remember noticing walking down the streets in Lviv that people would look down. And when you did talk to someone, they would talk to you very harshly. There was no softness. There was no kindness, which is so heartbreaking because as a Ukrainian American, you grew up with stories of Ukraine, and they're all glorious and they're all beautiful. And it's this mythical land where your parents came from, which will someday be restored to its glory. And when you get there, right, the trauma of being not a free country is visible, and it manifests itself in things like people like not being able to make eye contact, or people speaking very roughly. And this was such a disappointment. It was very painful. And it also became pretty obvious quickly what it was. And so you could always tell another foreigner in Ukraine, because we'd be walking upright, be looking around. We would not be like ashamed. And it was really, really hard. That is changing over the years, and it's going to take time. It is going to take time. People say that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, Moses was in the desert for 40 years with the people of Israel out of Egyptian slavery, because you needed a generation to kind of heal from being slaves before going to the promised land. And so these things take time. And now you see Ukrainians are really standing up for themselves. There's no more of this shyness. There's no more, not shyness, but there's no more of this shame or whatever it is. We also see this in the different kinds of the people who come from Ukraine to the United States. So my parents came with what's called usually the second immigration. The first immigration was the one you mentioned in the 1880s or so. That was an economic immigration. And then there is the refugee immigration, which is the one my parents are part of. Well, since then, there's been another generation of Ukrainian immigrants. And these are people coming for economic opportunities now that Ukraine's been free. But all this also explains why there are such strong ties between Ukrainian Americans and Ukrainians. And so it's basically two groups of folks. So I actually did a looking up for this. There's the first group that came when my parents came, and because they fled, those were not particularly they were not easy transitions. And so they left behind families. Some people made it out, some people did. A lot of my family didn't. And a lot of my family didn't survive that, but some did. And so my father had not seen his surviving family for decades, from when he was 16 to when he was, I don't know, probably, what would he be in 1990, until when he was like 60 or so. And so once it became possible to travel back and forth from Ukraine, I remember him going. He went the first time. He went with my brother, then he went with me, and I remember like meeting family, and they looked like me, they look like you recognize family immediately. It was so surprisingly natural. My uncle was actually my dad's cousin, but he talked like my dad. He looked like my dad. He had the same manners as my dad. I mean, there's something to be said for genetics. And so that happened to so many families in America. And then you brought your relatives over, you showed them America, you bought them stuff. So there's this rediscovery of family after many decades of separation, and finding out who's still alive, who's not. And so there's a lot of reunions. And so there's a strong connection there between Ukrainian immigrants and Ukrainians. But then the other thing that's happened is in the last 20 years, lots of Ukrainians have come over seeking better opportunities. They still have families back home. And so right now, I know that we're all glued to the news. And occasionally I hear like, oh, we care about this so much more. And I shouldn't say it that way. That we care about this maybe more so than we've cared about other conflicts. And I think to some extent, that's probably true. For what it's worth, every time I see, I think of that kid in Tiananmen Square standing in front of the tank with his hand up. That's one of the life-changing moments of my life. So I do think that we as humans respond to other people in pain regardless. But I think there is a lot of attention paid to this because there are people who know people in Ukraine right now. Lots of people who know people or are related to people in Ukraine right now. And so it's becoming kind of it's hitting closer to home maybe in some ways.
Yeah. And that's an important subject to address. I don't know that we can really answer it, why we are focusing more on this situation. I know people have suggested it has to do with racial issues because there have been other wars recently in the Middle East that people, or Africa. But I tend to think that, I mean, people do care about those instances too. The implications are a little bit different with this. It seems like because when you enter an Eastern European country, it could have been Latvia or Lithuania. It could have been a very small country too. And the level of fear, I think, heightens because we see historically what happens when Eastern European countries are invaded.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a shock. It's a shock. Like it's kind of unthinkable. A year ago, I don't think we well, maybe people were thinking of this, but like it's unthinkable that in our lifetime we just witnessed an attack, an unprovoked attack from an outside aggressor on a European country. It's scary. It's terrifying. It's terrifying for everybody. Some people, well, it's terrifying.
Yeah, as you say, unprovoked too. That's the action right there. There's and especially, there's no cause that the Ukrainians haven't been doing anything to the Russians. The idea that there's the things that Putin is coming up with are ludicrous. It's very difficult to understand his mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Like from what I understand, Ukraine has never fought an offensive war. Every war Ukraine has fought has been defensive. And when I say Ukraine at this point, I mean Kiev and Rus, the Lviv area. Like because it's not always been one unified country, but yeah, it's always been a defensive war. And so is this one. I mean, there's nobody wanted this.
Yeah, and this is it's very good. I think you started off establishing the geographical region where your family came from too, because it's those kinds of lines that are still being negotiated, like the exact boundaries of Ukraine and Poland and Russia. Those have been in flux over the past centuries, in fact, and so it makes it easy for some tyrants like someone like Putin, or in the case of Hitler before, to say, well, that region on the border, that has people that are more like us, and so we should be able to take that. That's historically ours. And whereas in the United States, you can't really make that claim. And so those kinds of geographical and historical differences make us, I think we live in kind of like a Goldilocks zone almost, where we don't have to worry about those kinds of things. And but we can't ignore those.
I think like Italy was a bunch of city states. Germany was a bunch of different. So this is not unusual for Europe to have the changing boundaries. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The importance of geography here is significant.
Definitely. And so I wanted to kind of round this out by also talking about some of the your kind of the people that you're in contact with in Ukraine right now.
Yeah. Ooh, boy. Yeah. In fact, right before we met just now, I just got an email from someone in Lviv who I know, who I've met. Actually, it's my cousin. It's one of the people that I met in 1989 when I went over, and she is emailing me to say that they're no longer able to get tourniquets because in the European countries they stopped selling them to people. Like here in this country, we can still go on Amazon and buy a medical grade tourniquet. You can't do that in the European Union right now because sadly, and this is so sad, they're keeping them in case they need them, in case war happens, bigger war happens. So you can no longer purchase tourniquets. So she would just emailed me just not like half an hour ago, asking me if we can arrange for some more tourniquets to be sent. So that's a big one. I got an email from a Ukrainian poet in Irpin. He is good friends with my dad. My dad's a big cultural figure, and so he's always interacting with different people. And so my dad forwarded to me, and then the poet himself sent me an eyewitness account of the bombing of Irpin, which is like they made it out, but they were literally like looking back, and there's flames and buildings falling down. And so these first person accounts are just like from people, it's imagine. So we live in Huntington, West Virginia. Like, I mean, I can't imagine looking at places where buildings used to be and not seeing them. It's just so real. And they're telling us that like they know a little bit of our news coverage, and they're grateful for it. They're very, very grateful for it. But there's no way, they're saying there's no way to convey the extent of the devastation. Another person, there's another person who's she's in her 70s and fragile health, and so these bombs and things going off. And there's another person who we know who's blind. Actually, there was a similar story on the news where you have people so you have the able-bodied people who are always going to be at an advantage, but then you have people who are older or disabled or differently abled who are now dependent on others to get them out, and that's just not a thing. That's just like it's very hard. There's people who are extremely vulnerable, which I guess is no surprise.
Gosh.
Ugh, yeah.
Well, that's the kind of perspective I wanted to get for the listeners too, to understand the different dimensions of the implications of this conflict as well. How do you think people can help now?
So I am a big believer in prayer. I mean, I mostly, and if no other reason, desperation right now. sending supplies. So there's plenty of good places out there. The Red Cross is always good. I mean, there's plenty of places out there, and there's also, sadly, there are sites that are not reputable, but Manor Junior College has a great site with like 6 places listed that people can help. There's an Amazon humanitarian aid to Ukraine Amazon list. That's something that I've been part of, where you literally click and there's trauma kits, Band-Aids, Advil. I mean, he's sending things like that over. I honestly, thankfully, the material response has been amazing. I think there's so many things coming into Ukraine. I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I wish I even knew what to advocate for. I mean, like everyone else, none of us want World War III. I mean, there's some argument to be said, maybe we're already in World War III. We're just so early on it, that we don't realize it. And if you look at how World War II started, did we know we were World II 3 weeks into it? And had we, would we have done something differently to prevent the loss of life and carnage to come? I just don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't even know what to, I don't even know what to advocate for, what to ask for. I don't know.
Yeah, but that's a place to start, though. Definitely Red Cross, the Amazon list as well. I think maybe Doctors Without Borders and
yeah, they're great. Yes, Doctors Without Borders are great. There's if you like afterwards, I can send you a link to the places that we've supported that we know personally, people who are working in. There is a group out of Philadelphia that is sending things to Lviv, but now it's actually Poland, and then they're driving into the various villages as needed. And there are things like everything from baby formula to boots to warm blankets and things like that. So, but I'll send you that list afterwards if that's okay.
Yeah, you bet. I can include that in the show notes for people to click on when they watch it on YouTube.
Can I show you something completely unrelated?
Please.
So I wanted to, I usually in the past I've talked about Ukraine a lot under happier circumstances, and so I feel kind of like I almost wanted to bring you like a bunch of stuff for show and tell, just to show you things. But like I know, and I feel weird doing this now because it seems so trivial and so stupid, just because things are so horrible. But like I wanted to show you like how I read Shakespeare in Ukrainian before. It was funny. I'm an English professor, and I read it in Ukrainian before reading it in English, because we have this is
Ukrainian translations. Wow.
This is Romeo and Juliet.
Can you read a line from it in Ukrainian?
I'll do my best. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Trying to find something. What is this? Oh, okay. Oh, this might be even the scene. Yeah, okay. This might be the Romeo and Juliet scene. Just randomly going to it. Okay, so this is Juliet, and I'll figure out what part of the story this is as I read it. So she's talking to, I think this might be the balcony scene. Лише твоє ім'я, мій ворог лютий, а ти, не зовсім Монтекю. Що це є Монтекю? Та ж, чи забудеш лице і плечі, ноги, груди, руки, або якось застилу тіло іншу? Ой, вибери собі нове ім'я. Та що ім'я? What's in the name? There we go. Та що ім'я? Назви троянду, не зміняючи в ній аромат солодкий. Yeah, that's the what's in the name part of Juliet. Not necessarily the best translation, but it's there. Here's Beowulf in Ukrainian. So we have, and the difference is like this was done here. There was a lack of access to Western text while it was still the Soviet Union. So these things are printed this was printed in Ukraine and a little bit edited. This was printed in the US recently in response to requests from Ukraine to kind of get Ukrainian universities to kind of get up to speed on what they've missed out on as far as Western lit goes. Fascinating.
Gosh. No, I always think that if people want to really understand a culture too, that food is one place to start, but then learning the language and being exposed to the music and the literature is so important.
And like the little arts and craft things that people do. Again, I hesitate, it's such a serious, sad time. I hesitate to show this, but I actually have these things behind me because anybody from Ukraine will recognize these are from 3 different regions of Ukraine. The embroidery, the pottery, and the woodworking. The only thing I don't have here is the Ukrainian Easter egg, a pisanka, which is pretty familiar. Most people, if they know anything about Ukraine, they'll know about the Ukrainian Easter eggs.
Oh, and the cultural artifacts are very important, I think, to show the flag as well. It just, it shows you that the people do have this very long and deep history too, where they've been making these things in order to explore the meaning of life. This is not just a region on the map that has 40 some odd million people. It's the size of Texas, but it has like 50% more of the population than Texas does, even.
Yeah. The flag, I know that historically, well, let me talk about the flag, what I understand the flag to be. I've heard other things since, but we grew up knowing that the blue is for the sky and the yellow is for the wheat fields. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and the ground is really good and sustains people. And so it was always, for us, it was always the blue sky and the waving wheat fields in the bottom.
Amazing. Yeah, when I first heard that interpretation, I thought that's just what a beautiful way to depict it. Of course, it's a big reason why other countries want access to Ukraine too, because of the rich fields there, and unfortunately, that's been so much of a part of Ukraine's history. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to share with us today?
No. Thank you for talking about Ukraine, and I'm sorry for not being particularly articulate. You'd think the thing I've lived all my life I'd be able to talk about, but it's sort of a really time of immense reflection, and I don't know. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about something that I truly deeply love and I'm very grateful for. And thank you for the work you're doing to help all of us learn more about this world that we live in.
Well, I appreciate you. When I heard you on the panel a couple of weeks ago, you, Victor, Anara, and Stefan, I think were so articulate in the way that you expressed yourselves about the new war at that time. And now, unfortunately, we're over 3 weeks into it. Thanks so much. And I look forward to working with you as well in the future as we work on this course on the Ukraine, Russia, and the US over the summer.
I'm so grateful to you. Thank you for your generosity.
Oh, no, thank you.